They say there are places you can go where the dead don't rest, but what they don't say, what they dare not say, is that sometimes the dead were never meant to leave at all. In the fog-drenched highlands of Kentucky, hidden beneath the silence of pine and stone, there stood an inn where 43 men found something far worse than death. The year was 1837, and the women who welcomed them offered more than love. They offered disappearance. The Millbrook Inn was not marked on most maps. It sat just off the wilderness road, nestled between two ridges where wagon wheels slowed, and shadows moved like memory. No one built an inn there by accident. You had to know. And the Cunningham Sisters, they knew everything. Margaret, the mind, Catherine, the charm, Sarah, the poison, Elizabeth, the mask. They weren't hostesses. They weren't caretakers. They were a machine. A machine built not of gears, but of weakness, of loneliness, of man's oldest hunger, the desire to feel seen. They didn't kill out of rage or desperation. They killed with ritual precision, as if performing a sacred rite. Every death a transaction, every grave a ledger entry. 43 visitors, 43 disappearances, not a single man found, not a single question answered. Until now. Because what you're about to hear, what has been buried for nearly 2 centuries, is not a story. It's a revelation. One so dangerous that men in power would rather you sleep, stay blind, stay numb. But if you're still here, then you're one of us, not a listener, a seeker. So lean closer and ask yourself, why would 4 beautiful women, alone on a mountain, bury 43 men in their backyard without leaving a trace? It began with kindness. That's what made it so easy, so invisible. No man questioned warmth on the road, especially not when it came with spiced bread, warm beds, and soft voices that remembered his name. At Millbrook Inn, every traveller was made to feel like a king, and kings, history teaches us, often fail to notice when the blade is being sharpened. You must understand, these weren't common frontier girls. The Cunningham Sisters were bred on isolation and strategy. Their father died in 1831, leaving them land, livestock, and a business built on trust. But trust, in the hands of certain minds, becomes something else. A weapon. Margaret understood the mathematics of grief. She could read a man's pocket by his boots, his loneliness by how he looked at the fire. She knew which guests were missed and which ones had made the world forget them already. Catherine had no need for strength. She had empathy, manufactured and tailored. She'd place a hand on yours and let silence do the damage. You'd think she understood your soul. You'd never realize she was just measuring how easy it would be to steal it. Sarah, the quiet one, spent her evenings boiling herbs and bottling silence. Her apothecary was equal parts medicine and murder. Nothing you drank at Millbrook Inn was ever just tea. And Elizabeth? She was the first thing you'd see. A girl with soft eyes and questions that felt harmless. She was the bait, the flower in the snare. They didn't see themselves as criminals. They saw themselves as accountants of decay, takers of men who thought no one was watching. And the truth is, no one was. In that silence, in that distance between ridge and ravine, the sisters created a closed system, a sanctuary, a prison, a laboratory. They weren't killing out of madness. They were refining a process. The third man arrived in May of 1834. His name was Calvin Rusk, a map surveyor from Virginia, soft-spoken, unmarried, and carrying a leather folio that, unknown to him, contained deeds worth a small fortune. He checked in with a polite nod. Elizabeth greeted him at the door barefoot, holding a wildflower she claimed he'd dropped, though he hadn't. That was the first test. He smiled and thanked her. That was the first mistake. That night, Rusk dined with the sisters. Sarah served venison stew and a tart made from apples the guests never saw growing. Catherine sat beside him, asking about the places he'd seen. She didn't interrupt. She didn't need to. She let his voice betray him. In his third sentence, he mentioned his mother's passing. In his fifth, the fiancé who'd broken the engagement. That was all Catherine needed. Loss, detachment, a man untethered. Margaret noted the way he lingered after dinner, asking if they had maps of the region. She told him she did. She didn't, but she had questions, disguised as interest, that peeled him open like bark. By morning they knew he was carrying more than maps. He had no employer tracking him, and he'd altered his travel route last minute. He wouldn't be missed. Not for weeks. And so the machine moved. Sarah offered him a tonic for the altitude headaches. He took it. Elizabeth asked him to read her one of his maps, saying she'd never seen a compass. He laughed, delighted. Catherine sat with him at dusk and asked about stars. And by the fourth night, he was coughing blood. The cause of death would later be recorded as consumption, as if fate had taken him, not the tincture laced with Sarah's cultivated foxglove. They buried him behind the oldest gravestone on the property. The earth didn't even resist. It took him gladly. And the deed folio burned. Because what the sisters feared more than being caught was being known. What you must understand now, what they never wrote down, is this. By 1835, the Cunningham Sisters were no longer experimenting. They were practicing a philosophy. To them, death was not an end. It was a correction, a form of refinement. They didn't kill randomly. They selected. They removed men from the world the same way a surgeon removes rot from bone. And like all true systems of control, it became religion. Margaret began keeping records, not in names, but in traits. Ledgers that listed the sins of the travelers: arrogance, lust, greed, loneliness, desperation. Catherine would classify them emotionally. Sarah assigned botanical responses. Elizabeth memorized every interaction like scripture. Their victims weren't mourned, they were studied. One winter, a preacher from Charleston arrived, Reverend Alden Crane. He wore a cross around his neck and a gun on his hip. He spoke with fire in his voice, quoting the book of Revelation at supper like he was daring God to interrupt. He told the sisters they were dangerous women and smiled like it was a compliment. They smiled back. Crane stayed 4 nights. On the 5th, his horse was found wandering the trailhead. Locals said he must have met bandits. The sisters agreed, nodding solemnly, saying they had prayed with him just hours before. His final sermon, they said, was full of passion. They didn't mention the tea. They didn't mention the headstone carved before he even died. But what makes this case different, what separates it from mere murder, is what they did after. They built a root cellar beneath the inn, reinforced with timber, lined with lime. Inside were not just bones, but books, drawings, records, symbols carved in mountain dialects long dead, formulas, theories. The Cunningham sisters were not killing to survive. They were transforming. Death was only the beginning of what they believed a man could become, if used properly. There comes a moment in every great deception when the liar begins to believe the lie. For the Cunningham sisters, that moment came in the summer of 1836, when the graveyard behind Millbrook Inn grew its 20th stone. By then, the sisters no longer feared discovery. They welcomed it. You see, once you've perfected the kill, you begin to hunger for the ritual. The process itself becomes intoxicating. like clockwork, like prayer. Each sister had her part. Each death followed a pattern. But with every man they buried, something deeper began to emerge. Something not born of greed or necessity. Power. Not the kind that shouts, the kind that whispers, the kind that changes how you walk, how you look a man in the eyes, knowing he has no idea he'll never see daylight again. The inn itself began to shift. Candles never stayed lit too long. Guests reported dreams, strange ones, of old staircases and faceless women humming lullabies in the dark. The air grew heavy, the mountain quieter. Locals whispered that the woods around the property no longer echoed. Birds stopped nesting there. Even the dogs refused to cross the fence line. But still the guests came, because desire overrules instinct every time. And that summer, a man arrived who almost ended everything. Nathaniel Grove, a former soldier turned bounty man, no stranger to death, no stranger to darkness. He noticed things. How Sarah's stew tasted like metal. How Catherine never blinked when she smiled. How Elizabeth always knew which pocket he kept his journal in. He stayed 2 nights. On the 3rd, he vanished. But not before carving a single word into the underside of the bed frame he'd been given. Lamb. He had seen it for what it was. Not an inn, not a refuge. A slaughterhouse dressed in perfume. By 1837, the Cunningham Sisters no longer viewed themselves as women. They saw themselves as judges. Each man who arrived at Millbrook Inn was weighed, not in pounds but in guilt, not in worth but in usefulness. If he passed their tests, he left. If he failed, he fed the system. But what no one outside that inn could grasp was that this wasn't simply murder for gain. It was ideology. They believed certain men were meant to disappear, men whose existence had become a burden to the world. They didn't kill out of hatred. They killed out of conviction. They had become something ancient, something primal, a quiet tribunal with velvet hands. By now, the sisters had begun crafting false letters, notes written in their victim's handwriting, mailed days after the man had left, letters to family, to business partners, to lovers, carefully forged, perfectly timed. Margaret had studied dozens of penmanship styles. Sarah handled the paper aging process. Catherine dictated the contents to fit the man's known voice. And it worked. There were no search parties. There were no questions, because the world believed the men were still alive. In August of that year, a Boston scholar named Emery Liddell arrived, carrying a satchel full of rare books and theories about ancient rites in early Appalachian settlements. He was greeted warmly, but unlike the others, he asked too many questions. He was fascinated by the architecture, the placement of the gravestones, the scent of burned sage near the baseboards, and when he noticed the rune carved into the cellar doorframe, a spiral inside a triangle, he began sketching it in his journal. The sisters knew. They watched. They discussed. And for the first time in 5 years, they hesitated. Because Emery wasn't a lamb, he was a mirror, and they weren't ready to be seen. The decision was Margaret's. As always, she sat in the kitchen that night, lit only by the flicker of oil lamps, the others silent around her. Catherine stirred her tea. Sarah sharpened a bone-handled knife not out of need, but ritual. Elizabeth, still only 22, watched them all with a kind of reverent fear. Emery Liddell could not be handled like the others. He wasn't moved by charm. He asked the right questions, then let silence stretch, waiting for lies to hang themselves. He had already seen the spiral rune, an old symbol traced back to Celtic bloodlines and early Appalachian death cults. He had written it down. He had taken it seriously. Most travelers forgot the oddities. He preserved them. And so, Margaret decided on a new protocol. Not poison, not seduction, something older. Ritual. Sarah retrieved a bundle from beneath the floorboards. Rawhide, black feathers, and 3 wax-sealed jars marked in mountain glyphs no longer found in books. These weren't tools of death. They were tools of transference. You see, Emery believed he was uncovering history, but he was stepping into it. That night, Catherine offered him wine and asked if he believed in second lives. He laughed. "Reincarnation?" he asked. "Superstition dressed in mystery." She smiled. "Not quite." Midway through the night he began choking, not from poison, but from breathlessness. No swelling, no fever, just an overwhelming sensation that something inside him was trying to get out. He fell from the bed, body cold, eyes wide. But the sisters did not bury him. They burned him. Not in the open, but in a pit lined with mountain salt and sealed with ash. The fire burned green. The smoke curled backwards, like something trying to return. Why? Because Emery Liddell had come too close to the origin. He hadn't just seen the spiral. He'd understood it. And for that, they could not risk a grave. By the time the leaves fell in the autumn of 1837, the land around Millbrook Inn had changed. Not visibly, not in the way roads fade or crops die, but spiritually. People who passed by said the wind felt wrong. It didn't whistle, it spoke. Whispers moved through the trees like memory trying to crawl back into flesh. The Cunningham Sisters had crossed a line, and they knew it. Emery Liddell's death hadn't just removed a threat. It had awakened something. The spiral was no longer just a mark carved into doors and books. It had become a kind of signal, drawn in ash behind the fireplace, etched into the soles of shoes left behind by guests, woven into the lace of Elizabeth's dress. It wasn't art. It was alignment. The sisters had come to believe that by killing the right men, and by arranging their deaths according to ancient law, they could open something. Not metaphorically. Literally. A gate, a veil, a way through. They began constructing the Room of Hours in the inn's west wing, a space no guest ever saw. The walls were covered in blackened oak, no windows. The only light came from candles shaped like twisted branches. At the center, a table made of 4 coffins, arranged like compass points. Above it, a chandelier of bones. No one outside the sisters ever entered that room, except one. A young girl, no more than 12, escaped from the nearby orphan caravan that passed through Millbrook once a year. She wandered in during a storm, lost, cold, unafraid. The sisters took her in, fed her, gave her warmth. Then took her into the Room of Hours. What happened that night was never written, but neighbors miles away reported seeing strange flashes in the clouds, light with no thunder, smoke that hovered like a halo over the inn, unmoving. The girl was never seen again, and from that day on, the inn never cast a shadow, not even at noon. By the first snow of 1838, silence had settled over Millbrook Inn. Not the kind born of peace, but of containment. The land surrounding the property no longer obeyed the weather. Trees near the inn refused to shed their leaves. Animals wouldn't cross the fence line. The soil, once rich and dark, had turned pale, like it had been drained. And still, travellers came. Some were drifters. Some were wealthy men seeking escape. But most had no idea they were being watched before they even arrived. You see, the Cunningham sisters were no longer choosing men by instinct. They were using something older, something found, not invented. a ledger. It was discovered behind a false wall in the basement, wrapped in lambskin, pages bound in twine soaked with wax. No title, no dates, just names. Names of men who had not yet arrived, men who had not yet sinned, but would. Catherine believed the book was sent by whatever force they had awakened in the room of hours. Sarah called it the mirror. Margaret, always the clearest-eyed, called it proof. Proof that judgment was not cruelty, but obedience. The names listed were exact. First name, middle initial, last. One by one each man arrived. Some within days, some took months. But they always came. And each time the sisters greeted them like prophecy fulfilled. One of them, a clergyman named Thomas Baird, tried to resist. He sensed something in the house, claimed he heard music playing from inside the walls, choirs, but off-key, Latin chants with wrong words. He stayed one night. On the second, he attempted to flee. He didn't make it past the gate. His body was found posed like a martyr, arms outstretched in the garden, eyes sewn open with hair. The message was clear. Even holy men answer to deeper laws. After Baird's death, the spiral began appearing in dreams, not just to the sisters, but to those nearby. Farmers, sea, Hildren, travellers who almost stopped but turned away at the last moment. It was as if the inn had become sentient, calling out, growing bold. And with each new grave, it grew louder. The town of Millbrook was small, 30 families, a church, and a butcher who drank more than he carved. Most townsfolk kept their distance from the inn on the hill. But not out of superstition, out of memory. You see, before it was an inn, that land had been a burial site, not one with tombstones or markers, but something older, earthen mounds, half forgotten, the kind native tribes refused to speak of. They called it a place where the world wore thin, and the Cunningham Sisters, they built directly on top of it. By the winter of 1838, the graves behind the inn numbered 31. The sisters buried the bodies in perfect lines, east to west, heads turned to the rising sun. Ritual mattered. Direction mattered. Each death wasn't random, it was geometry. Elizabeth, once the most hesitant, had become the keeper of the soil. She tended to the graves with care, speaking to the ground, planting white orchids at each head. She claimed the flowers grew only if the death had been righteous, and every single one bloomed. By now, whispers had begun spreading beyond Millbrook. Travellers on horseback told stories of women who could see into a man's soul, who offered comfort before the reckoning. People came not for lodging, but absolution. They confessed things they had never said aloud. Affairs, murders, desires they feared would damn them, and the sisters, serene, beautiful, unknowable, offered them wine, warmth, and judgment. Some left, most didn't. And those who vanished were spoken of with reverence, as if the inn were not a place of death, but a kind of temple. A new religion was forming, not one written in scripture or sermons, but in secrets. And in the background, the spiral grew, etched into frost, burned into bark, spotted in the eyes of the sisters like a reflection that didn't belong. By the end of that winter, the Cunningham women no longer walked through town. They didn't have to. Millbrook had already begun praying to them. By early spring of 1839, the world outside the inn had begun to decay, but only near the boundaries. Wells ran dry. Cattle gave birth to stillborn calves. Fires wouldn't catch unless blessed with words no one had taught the children. The townspeople whispered of a shift, as if reality itself had become thin near Millbrook. Days felt shorter. Mirrors gave back strange reflections. The church bell, once clear and bright, now rang with a hollow sound, like it was buried. But inside the inn, it was warm, golden, eternal. The sisters had stopped aging, at least visibly. Margaret's streak of grey vanished. Sarah's hands, once cracked from work, had grown smooth. Catherine's voice had become lower, velvet soft, like it came from a place beneath the ribs. Visitors still arrived, more now, from further away. And the ledger continued to fill. Not with names alone, but symbols, glyphs no one had ever seen before. They moved on the page when stared at too long. One man, a scholar from New York, tried to translate them, said they spoke of agreements, not commandments, that the sisters had entered into a covenant. 3 nights after he said this aloud, he was found with every tooth removed, arranged in a perfect circle around his head. There was no blood, and he died smiling. By this time, the room of ours had changed again. Witnesses, few and unreliable, spoke of a mirror that didn't reflect the room, but another version of it. One where the furniture was rotted, the candles burned blue, and the spiral spun backwards. Some claimed the sisters went into the mirror and returned, altered. They spoke in unison at times, laughed at things no one else heard, and sometimes, when the inn was quiet, you could hear scratching under the floorboards. Not rats, fingernails. They had opened something, and it was no longer asking to be fed. It was demanding, and the sisters, both, and by the pact they had never spoken aloud, obeyed. The graves behind the inn now numbered 40. But it was the 41st that no one could explain, because no one remembered digging it. The 41st grave had no name, no marker, no record. One morning it was just there, fresh soil mounded high, orchids already blooming, though no one had planted them. Margaret stood beside it for hours, unmoving. When Catherine approached, she whispered a single phrase. "It's not for a man." That night, thunder rolled across a cloudless sky. Doors inside the inn opened and shut by themselves. Lamps flickered even with fresh oil. And at midnight, every mirror inside the house cracked, not shattered, just split down the center, like a wound opening across glass. The townspeople began to turn, not out of fear, but awe. They started leaving offerings at the inn's gate, candles, feathers, teeth, hair braided and tied with ribbon. Some carved the spiral into their barns, their doors, their children's toys. Not everyone understood why. They just felt it, like an instinct. One woman, Esther Rowe, claimed she saw one of the sisters levitate during a thunderstorm. She said Sarah's feet left the ground as if wind carried her, arms outstretched, head tilted to the stars. When asked why she wasn't afraid, Esther said, "Because it was beautiful." But beauty had a cost. Inside the inn, time had begun to fracture. Clocks ran backward. Guests reported waking in rooms that hadn't existed the night before. One man insisted he saw his younger self at the end of the hall, watching him sleep. Catherine started writing in her sleep, pages and pages in a language with no vowels, inked in charcoal, then folded into triangles and burned. Elizabeth no longer spoke at all. She just hummed. A low, rhythmic tune that made the floorboards tremble. It echoed the spiral, round and round, drawing everything inward. By spring's end, one final change occurred. The sisters stopped eating, not out of starvation, out of completion. They had fed long enough. Now, something else was returned, Eddie to feed. And that 41st grave, it wasn't empty. It wasn't for a man, and it wasn't for the dead. It was for what comes next. By summer, Millbrook no longer resembled a town. It had become a threshold. Grass refused to grow near the inn. Trees bent away from it, as if straining to escape. Birds circled but never landed. And at night, the wind carried whispers, not echoes, but conversations, in a language no one could remember learning. The spiral was now everywhere, branded into livestock, carved into teeth, birthed into dreams, but those who dreamed it too often began to change. They withdrew, spoke less, ate little. Some dug holes in their basements, saying they were preparing for return. A young boy was found kneeling in the woods, eyes white, chanting about a door that breathed. And still people arrived. From distant cities, foreign lands, drawn by letters they didn't recall writing. Invitations sealed with wax that bore the spiral, always addressed the same way, to the one who carries the wound. Inside the inn, the sisters began to perform rituals, not in secret, but in plain view. In the room of ours, guests were asked to kneel and hold mirrors to their faces. Some began sobbing without knowing why. Others laughed until they passed out. Those who resisted were never seen again. The ledger, once written in ink, was now filled in blood, and yet it grew more beautiful. The glyphs shimmered under candlelight. The pages turned on their own. And then, one night, the spiral changed direction. The air in the inn thickened. Visitors fell ill. Screams were heard from the walls, but not in fear, in revelation, as if pain was the price of enlightenment. Elizabeth returned to speech, but only one sentence. "It's almost ready." Catherine stopped sleeping entirely. Margaret no longer blinked. And at the base of the 41st grave, something began to pulse. Not a heart, not a machine, but something old, something watching. And as the moon turned red, for the third time At month, the townspeople gathered on the hill without knowing why. No one spoke. No one moved. They simply stared at the inn as one by one, the candles in its windows were extinguished. And behind the last flame, a new figure stood. Not a guest. Not a sister. But something that had been waiting to be born. The figure behind the final candle had no face. Not truly. It wore the suggestion of one, eyes drawn in soot, a mouth stitched in silence, features that changed if stared at too long. Some saw a man, others a woman, a few, none at all. But all agreed on one thing. It was not human. The sisters knelt before it the moment it appeared. Not in fear. In devotion. The figure didn't move. It simply was, like gravity or hunger. The room around it began to peel at the edges, wallpaper flaking like skin, floorboards turning black, as if shadow had weight. And the spiral? It now spun within the figure's chest, glowing faintly. Elizabeth spoke first. "You are the guest. You are the house. You are the meal." Catherine followed. "You have always been expected." And Margaret, smiling, "Let it be opened." The walls trembled, not with noise, but with permission. Outside, the townspeople fell to their knees, eyes rolled back, mouths moving in unison. No one taught them the words. They simply knew them, as if the knowledge had been seeded long ago. At the graveyard, the soil of the 41st plot split. But nothing climbed out. Instead, the figure began to sink in. The ground accepted it like water. And as it disappeared into the grave that had never been dug, a sound rolled through Millbrook, low, metallic, endless. Not a scream, not a roar, a welcoming. The inn changed shape. It grew taller. Its halls reconfigured, Rooms that never existed now stretched for miles. The front door vanished, replaced by a stone arch inscribed with moving runes, and every window flickered with faces. Not people, but watchers, dreamers, the remembered dead. Then silence. For 7 days, no one entered. No one left. And on the 8th, a girl was born in the graveyard, wrapped in red velvet, eyes black as pitch, a spiral carved into her tongue. She was carried into the inn by the sisters, who hadn't aged a day. They whispered to her like a prayer, like a warning, like a prophecy. Because this girl, she wasn't the end. She was the threshold. They named her Honora. But that was not her true name. Her true name was never spoken, only remembered, like a wound or a promise. The sisters said she had been born before many times in many forms, always at the turning of an age, always near a grave. By her first breath, Honora could already stand. By her first hour, she could speak. And her voice? It sounded like 100 voices layered atop each other, whispering secrets that made listeners bleed from the ears or fall to their knees in worship. The sisters became her caretakers, but not her guardians. She didn't need protection. She was protection for something still waking. The inn shifted again. A staircase opened beneath the graveyard, descending into impossible geometry. Rooms inside rooms, halls that led to memories, corridors that smelled of time itself. Honora walked those halls barefoot, always barefoot. Where she stepped, stone turned soft, wallpaper wept, and light bent as if ashamed. Townspeople who saw her described visions afterward, not dreams, visitations. One man claimed she showed him the moment he was born from the other side. A widow swore Honora told her the name of her unborn daughter, who later arrived with the spiral on her back. Pilgrims came by the hundreds now, not to stay, not to be healed, but to surrender. They left behind their names, their memories, their reflections. In return, they were given something unspeakable: clarity. But clarity is a dangerous thing. Some tore out their eyes to preserve the last image she showed them. Others walked into the woods and never returned, saying they were following her voice backwards. And inside the inn, beneath the spiral arch, a room opened that had no door, only a mirror. Honora stood inside it, facing her reflection. Or rather, something inside the mirror that looked like her, but older, angrier, hungrier. She reached toward it. So did the reflection. And when their hands touched the glass, every child in Millbrook screamed at once, then fell silent. Their eyes now pitch black. Their words in perfect unison: "She is almost ready." Midnight struck. But the moon did not rise. Instead, the spiral did. Not in the sky, but within it, unfolding above Millbrook like a great, dark eye. It pulsed with breath, with memory, with something older than time. The inn's walls peeled back, revealing what had always been hidden, that it was never a building. It was a vessel. And the sisters, Elizabeth, Catherine, Margaret, were not sisters at all. They were keys, their bodies worn, their voices borrowed, their names only veils stretched over something terrible and divine. In the cellar, the spiral on the floor opened. Not metaphorically. The symbol split apart, revealing a black stairwell spiraling downward, impossibly deep. From its depths, wind rose, not air, but remembrance. It smelled like every funeral that had ever been whispered through history. Honora stood at the threshold. Not a girl. Not any more. Her eyes burned with galaxies. Her veins shimmered with ancestral light. The spiral on her tongue glowed so brightly that it illuminated the bones beneath her skin. She did not speak. She commanded, and the ground obeyed. The town of Millbrook began to sink. Not crumble, not collapse, but descend slowly, as if being pulled beneath the earth by an invisible hand. Screams echoed, but not from terror, from transformation. Those who resisted shattered like glass. Those who accepted it vanished, smiling. The 43 graves cracked open, not to release bodies, but secrets. Each grave held a piece of something too large for one mind to bear. Names never spoken aloud, events erased from time, symbols older than Genesis. And as the last piece emerged, an eye made of stone and salt, it floated into Honora's chest, completing her. She turned to the sisters, now kneeling, heads bowed, fading into ash, and whispered the final phrase, "The guest has arrived." Above, the spiral sky burst open. From it, light poured, not warm, not cold, but true. And from that light descended not an angel, not a god, but a shape, indescribable, endless, familiar in the way nightmares are familiar. The Millbrook Inn was no more. In its place stood a tower of bone, of memory, of time undone, and at its peak, Honora stood, smiling. Because this was never about horror. It was about return. And now, the door was open. Forever.